What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So, I was thinking about Tom Aspinall and what his potential is as a champion, because upon some reflection, I actually believe he not only has a realistic shot at being the best champion of his era, but more importantly, I think he might be a champion the likes of which we all kind of believed would never happen again in the sport. And by that I mean he could be a champion in the style of guys like Anderson Silva or George St. Pierre or Mighty Mouse. You know, these champions with this huge amount of longevity, these long title reigns, a million defenses. Like Tom could be that kind of guy. And again, that's a kind of champion that in recent years we've all just kind of realized like doesn't really happen anymore. You know, the landscape is different. The talent pools in the divisions are bigger, so it takes longer to get to the UFC, longer to work your way up to a title shot. And by the time guys become champions, they just don't have that many years of their prime left, so they just don't rack up a million defenses, you know? And that's fine. That doesn't mean they're worse fighters. In fact, it makes being a champion in some ways more impressive now. But Tom has a real shot of being this sort of champion of old, you know, this reigning king of his division. And I think that's particularly interesting because if you've been watching my channel for a while and you've seen my other videos where I've talked about Tom's career, I've actually said very pessimistic things about him because I think it's going to be very difficult for him to actually become the heavyweight GOAT. And the chief reason is because he just doesn't have other GOATs of the division to fight. You know, because if you look at all the other champions, or at least the other champions of note, they all have wins over other GOATs of the division. Just, you know, go through the list. You know, Stipe has wins over Ngannou. He has wins over DC. He has wins over Verdum, over Overeem. Verdum has wins over Cain Velasquez and Fedor. Cain has wins over JDS and Brock Lesnar. JDS has a win over Cain, a win over a young Stipe. You know, Nogueira has wins over Crow Cop, over Josh Burnett. You know, Fedor, of course, has wins over Crow Cop and Nogueira. And, you know, it just kind of leaves Tom in a bad spot because Stipe effectively retired after he lost to Ngannou. Because imagine a different scenario. Imagine a scenario where Stipe stuck around a little bit longer. Maybe he gets another win. Maybe he is the opponent that Tom fights for the interim belt instead of Sergey Pavlovich. Boom, all of a sudden he has this win over Stipe. You know, the name value on his resume looks a lot better. And so Stipe retired, and then Ngannou left. You know, because imagine if Ngannou had stuck around and Stipe actually dethroned him. Boom, all of a sudden, he has this great win. He has another kind of great heavyweight on his resume. And then, of course, John Jones, who maybe not like an all-time great heavyweight or anything, but nevertheless, you know, a legitimate heavyweight. You know, he defeated Cyril Gane and, you know, less than a round. And the greatest light heavyweight of all time, one of the greatest fighters of all time, if he could have beaten John, if he could have been the one to finally end that guy's streak, his unbeaten streak, that would have meant a lot. But, you know, again, two of these guys retired and one of them left. That's not Tom's fault, but it means that despite the fact that he's clearing out the division, despite the fact that he has good heavyweights on his resume, you know, Curtis Blades is a very good heavyweight, Volkov is a very good heavyweight, you know, it's not terrible. But it's lacking in the real name value, and it's lacking in having like other great champions, other GOATs on it. And beyond that, like he not only doesn't have other great heavyweights on his resume, but he especially doesn't have any in their prime, because that's a thing very few people have. Even Stipe. This is why I've been very critical of the people who claim that Stipe is the heavyweight GOAT, that he is better than Fedor. Because they'll say, like, oh, but just look at the strength of schedule. Look at the quality of names on Stipe's resume. To which I say, yes, but every single person Stipe beat was past their prime. And that's true. Just go through the list. Andrei Arlovsky, past his prime. Mark Hunt, past his prime. Verdum, past his prime. Overeem, past his prime. You know, Junior Dos Santos. Like, he lost to Junior Dos Santos when he was already kind of old, and then he beats him in the rematch when he's past his prime. You know, he goes 1-1 with Ngannou. You know, he goes 2-1 with Cormier, and Cormier is past his prime. And granted, they're both older, but, you know, Cormier was older than Stipe, and Cormier won the first fight, and Stipe won the two when they were both older. So it's like Stipe just doesn't have any prime wins over other, like, great fighters. Whereas, you know, Fedor has those 2 fights with Nogueira and that fight with Crow Cop, which is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting on its resume. He has other great wins too. He beat Mark Hunt, he beat Andrei Arlovsky, he beat Kevin Randleman. The first Coleman win is good. The Semi-Schilt win, the Herring wins. Tim Sylvia, Brett Rogers. Brett Rogers was top 10 at the time. Like, Fedor has a lot of good wins, but it's the Nogueira and Crow Cop wins that are doing the heavy lifting. Like, that's what makes him a top 10 GOAT to me and not just a top 30 GOAT or something. And so circling back to Tom, like, he's in a really bad spot because, just the gap between him and Stipe is going to be quite challenging because Stipe, again, at least has people like Verdum, like Overeem, like DC on his resume, and Tom does not. And then beyond that, the gap between him and Fedor is all the bigger. And that's why I've been kind of pessimistic about him in the past. However, again, he has a real shot here of becoming a long-reigning champion, becoming a champion with 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 defenses. Like, he could be like an Anderson Silva, because that's who I keep thinking of. Because Anderson Silva's title reign, the name value is not great. There's some good ones on there like Dan Henderson and Vitor, but on the whole, it's not amazing. You got Patrick O'Tay and Talis Latis and Damian Maia and Yushin Okami and like these sorts of people. It's not that inspiring. And similarly with Mighty Mouse, people are quite critical of Mighty Mouse's resume, and I've made videos defending his resume, saying the flyweight division was a lot better than people give him credit for. But even with that being said, like, what are the best wins? It's like maybe John Dodson, maybe Joseph Benavidez, maybe the first win over Cejudo, but like, there's not a lot of like all-time great, names on that resume or anything. And it's mostly like a combination of the longevity, the number of defenses, the general quality of the opponent, but the skill gap. Like, that's what's so impressive about it, both with Mighty Mouse and with Anderson. It was seeing that this guy who was the champion could fight the number 1 contender or a top 5 opponent, whoever it might be, and just be light years ahead of them. That's what was so cool. And Tom can do that. Because I think about when Anderson was on top. Like, I remember vividly when he fought Yushin Okami. It was a really fun card. It was in Brazil. It was a real feel-good night of fights for the Brazilians because it was the card where Nogueira knocked out Brendan Schaub. It was the card where Shogun avenged his loss to Forrest Griffin and knocked him out. And then in the main event, Anderson Silva just completely dog walks Yushin Okami and knocks him out in, I think, the second round. And that's not like an amazing win. That's not a, oh my God, you beat Yushin Okami, you're the GOAT kind of win. But it was the skill gap. It was the, like, we're just tuning in to watch this guy perform. We don't even take his opponent seriously. And Tom is kind of entering that territory. He has a 100% finishing rate. He's got the record shortest amount of time per fight in the UFC. He's an all-rounder. He's a good grappler, a good striker. He can submit you. He can knock you out. And in that way, he's this sort of, he again, just reminds me of these all-time great champions of old. He has that Anderson Silva effect a bit where it's like, yeah, I'm just here to watch you style on this dude and finish him in some cool way. He has the Mighty Mouse effect where he's so well-rounded that you can just tell, like, yeah, if he feels like it or if it suits him, he's going to strike with you. He's going to knock you out. If he feels like it, if it suits him, he's going to wrestle you. If he feels like it, if it suits him, he's going to submit you. Like, you are just so categorically not on his level as a martial artist that it's hopeless. And we're just kind of here to watch that happen. And I remember even thinking about GSP when I first saw the fight between Tom Aspinall and Volkov. I remember watching that live and watching him, he switches stances, he goes southpaw, he throws the backhand, and he uses that to enter on the body lock, and he hits that trip. And I remember thinking, like, that's like George St. Pierre shit. It's by the standards of heavyweight. Don't get me wrong. That's not actually George St. Pierre level shoot fighting. But mixing it up like that, using your strikes to set up your grappling, your takedowns, for heavyweight, that is extremely good. And I remember thinking that back then. And, again, like, he has the room to make this happen because he's still pretty young. He's only 32. And if you compare it to those other champions, they tend to be on top for about 5 or 6 years. If you look at Fedor from like Nogueira to when he lost to Verdum, if you look at George St. Pierre's title run, if you look at Jose Aldo's title run, if you look at Anderson Silva's title run, if you look at Mighty Mouse's title run, like it tends, you look from when they win the belt to when they lose, it tends to be about 5 or 6 years. And, most of us are going to look at the interim belt win over Pavlovich as when Aspinall's actual title reign began. Most of us view the Blades victory as just a normal title defense, and we're viewing this Gane fight as a second title defense. And in that way, like, that would mean that he's had the belt for 2 years. There was a lot of time off, so it might not quite be the same as far as, like, how long to expect it to go. But he's 32 years old. This is heavyweight. I think he's an athletic guy, so he might not... we'll see how he ages, because on the one hand, you could expect to see like, oh, his speed is going. All of a sudden, and his reflexes are going. All of a sudden, he's getting hit more. Boom, he starts getting knocked out. That could be bad for him. On the flip side, sometimes athletes age surprisingly slowly. You look at Davison Figueiredo, Yoel Romero. When you're way more athletic than everyone else, all of a sudden, you being 38 is just the equivalent of them being in their prime in terms of your physicality. And on top of that, with the grappling, with the skill set, with the well-roundedness, Tom can make changes. Tom can be like, ooh, I don't feel as fast anymore. I'm going to rely more on my wrestling. I'm going to rely more on my grappling. Like, he might just still have such a skill advantage over his contemporaries that, like, it just doesn't fucking matter that he's aging out. So, with that all said, I think it's very realistic that he could be 35, 36, 37 before he loses the belt. And, if he's defending a couple times a year, like, he's gonna rack up a huge ass streak of defenses. Because again, he's 32 years old, he's about to make his second defense, and most of us are picking him to win. And most of us, even those of us who are recognizing that Gane is a tricky matchup in certain ways, and could actually be one of the hardest fights in the division for him, like, we're still all picking Tom. And if he gets past Gane, like, we could all imagine him within the next year or year and a half taking out Almeida, taking out Derek Lewis, maybe taking out Poatan, and boom, all of a sudden, that's 5 title defenses. And then he does whatever. He fights whoever, he has a rematch against whoever's looking good, or he fights some other up-and-comer, or maybe they get some champion from some other organization, like when they brought in Asakura to fight Pantoja, and very quickly, this could start looking like a George St. Pierre style of a title reign. And I don't know exactly where that puts him GOAT-wise. Like, I'm not necessarily reneging on my claim that, like, he's just not going to be able to catch up to someone like Fedor, who both has the longevity and the name value and the prime wins. But it could mean that he's like a top 20 GOAT. Because I personally have Fedor at number 10. And, it could be enough to eclipse Stipe. Like, it could be enough to put Tom at that number 2 spot. Because then it would be like, name value, but not in their prime for Stipe versus defenses and longevity for Tom. And just sheer gulf, of difference between him and his opponents. Like, I think that's a doable thing. I think he could replace Stipe as number 2. And again, like, crack into like a top 20 kind of range as an all-time GOAT, and just be notable as being this modern day Anderson Silva, this modern day Mighty Mouse, this unicorn, this thing that we thought we'd never see again. And I think there's a real shot. It's heavyweight, so you can't count your eggs before they hatch. It's a division where you zig when you should have zagged, and boom, it's over. You eat a hard punch because everyone hits hard up there. And even sloppy guys, they're still knockout artists. You can always lose to a Derek Lewis. You can always lose to a Tai Tuivasa, even if you're way better than them. And it being heavyweight, even though he's very skilled compared to the other guys, he might still have deficiencies we're unaware of. Like, he might fight Almeida and just get put in a bottom position of some kind, and we might just realize, oh, he actually if you just flatten him out in half guard, he fucking sucks. Like, he looks good in all the grappling footage we watch, but, against Almeida, he might suck. I'm not betting on that to happen. I think Aspinall appears to have all the goods, but you never know. It's heavyweight. Like, people have looked very promising and have looked skilled only to have it be revealed that they kind of suck. Just look at Gane versus Jones. Gane had shown some promising grappling skills. And since losing to John, he's even shown some promising development. Like, he looks like he's actually been working on his grappling a bit, and he looked okay against Volkov. But ultimately, it kind of just showed, like, no, actually, the gulf, what's good for you in terms of grappling compared to what's good for John Jones is just too massive a gulf. And we might find something similar for Tom. He might just get matched up against someone who has a certain skill set that can exploit this glaring hole that we just haven't really discovered yet. So we'll see. I'm not saying bet the house that this will happen, but I am saying there's a very plausible shot. And I think he is in a position to do this where no one else is. Like, Pantoja's not in a position to do this. People are talking about Merab, like Merab is just going to win forever. And I get it in the sense that I'm very high on Merab in terms of what his fighting abilities are. And I've made videos, I made one recently about how I think he could beat Volk and how I think pound for pound, like, no one beats him and yada yada. But he's already like 35. He's not going to be around that long. Like, if nothing else, Father Time will take Merab out. And he's not, he might break Anderson's win streak, but he's not going to, like, get 9 title defenses. You know what I mean? Like, he just doesn't have the fucking time. Same with Volk. Like, Volk's, I think has 6 defenses, or maybe it's like 5 defenses and 7 title wins, maybe is actually more accurate. But same with him. Like, he might get 1-2 more, but he's on his way out. Ilya could maybe do it, but, like, even if he could, like, do any of us think he's sticking around that long? Islam's getting up there in age. JDM, is still young, but at welterweight, that's going to be a tall order. I mean, many of us didn't even think he deserved his shot against Bilal. And he's now making his first defense, and it's against Islam fucking Makhachev. And then after that, he's got Sean Brady and Ian Gary and Shavkat Rakhmonov and all. I wouldn't write him off, but I would be surprised if, like, 4 years from now, we're watching JDM defend his belt for the 9th time. I'd be pretty surprised. Chimaev, definitely skilled enough, definitely in, like, a bad enough division. With him, I mostly just don't think he'll fight that often, and that worries me, because I could turn what could be a very exciting situation into a very dull one very quickly. And then Poatan is old. Poatan's like 38. It was very remarkable that he did what he did against Ankalaev, and I'd like to see him continue his success. Like, I'd even like to see him beat Tom and just get the 3rd belt. Like, I think that would be cooler to see than to see Tom have this GSP-like string of defenses. But I wouldn't bet on him to beat Tom at heavyweight. And so, again, this ultimately leaves us in a situation where Tom is kind of the guy to do this. And he's got, he very well might have a better than 50% chance of doing it. Like, it might be the likely outcome that 3-4 years from now, he's still the sitting champion, and he's still just, like, cleaning house on these dudes. So I'm here for it. I like Tom. He's a very exciting fighter. He seems like a good guy. And, while I was sort of, again, I was down on the fact that it's like, he has no one to fight, and he's not going to have anyone to fight, and that's just going to permanently hold him back. Him becoming the unicorn who just does what old champions did, but in the new era, that's pretty special, and that I would like to see. So, let's watch and find out.